Hi folks, hope you're enjoying and benefiting from our guitar lesson series. Remember, it's essential that you watch these lesson videos in order. Each lesson leads into the next, and you won't get the big picture if you skip any of the steps. Many of you have been searching for these answers for years. You might be tempted to jump ahead and look at lesson 24 because you're into the blues, but if you don't know your intervals and modes from lesson 12 and 17, you just ain't going to get it. Consider purchasing the 150-page official course handbook for $19.95 from our website at www.absolutelyunderstandguitar.com. You'll find that link multiple places here on our YouTube channel. Each of the 32 video lessons has a corresponding printable page that you can view to help with review and memorization. All of the charts and graphs I create in the videos are reprinted there. The package also includes our amazing chord, scale, and arpeggio encyclopedia containing most every useful finger pattern known to man. Reserve your copy today. If you like what you're learning here, tell all your friends and like and subscribe to our channel. So enjoy this lesson and continue on, and you will absolutely understand guitar.
Hi, welcome back to Absolutely Understand Guitar. I'm Scotty West. Wow, we're getting on toward the end of it. Today, we talk about chord progressions, the sixth and final level of pitch theory. You already know a lot about progressions because, as we saw, they evolve out of systems of modes through the process of harmonizing a scale. This is lesson 30, so make sure your book is open to page 30. You'll also need your slide rule. All set? Here we go. Hi, I just got a couple of quick things I got to remind you about that we didn't quite get to the end of on the subject of chord voicing. Remember, when you know the formula for a chord, that's just the beginning. You know a major chord is 1, 3, 5, but remember that can be expressed a lot of different ways. There are closed voicings, open voicings. You can change the order of the notes that you play. If you put the third on the bottom, that's what's known as first inversion. If you put the fifth on the bottom, that's what's known as second inversion. This is related to slash chords. Then we went on to talk about the notion that that there are more than 5 ways to play a major chord on the guitar, because inside of your 5 basic finger forms are all these little 3-chord subforms that we learned about. There are also some open voicings that you can coax out of the guitar here too. So really, there's many ways to play a major chord on the guitar, but they are all related to these 5 shapes over here. You have a sheet just like this in your support material, so make sure you're looking at all these different voicings for chords. The last subject that we began to tackle is the fascinating world of 4-part harmony and what's known as voice leading. A lot of you had this in music theory courses and were completely confused about it, but because I think they introduce it oftentimes they introduce it too early in the program, and people don't really get how this stuff works. 4-part harmony is mostly for instrumental music where it's not really polyphonic instruments. It's an ensemble of monophonic instruments, like a brass band or a wind ensemble or a string quartet or indeed a full orchestra. Remember, these are monophonic instruments that can't play chords, so the way you get chords out of this type of music is by having a number of players all playing at the same time. Even when there are more than 4 players, oftentimes, even in a full orchestra setting, it is very often thought of as the harmonic structure of the piece really has 4 parts. The lowest is called the bass, the low middle is the tenor, the high middle is the alto, and the top is called the soprano. And if we look up in this corner over here, we saw that a picture of the way that music moves is you've got these 4 groups or 4 individuals, and each one of them is playing a melody where the notes are going down and up. But if you look at any particular moment at the notes that are stacked on top of each other, that's where the harmony comes from. And this type of music employs, essentially, I want to say, the same types of chord progressions that we've seen in our diatonic type 1, 4, 5, 2, 3, 6. It's just that each player has to not only pay attention to how their individual notes flow in the individual melodies that they play, but they also have to notice how they stack on top of each other to form the different chords. Now, an example that we gave here last time was maybe there's a C major chord, and maybe after that you're going to go to an F major chord, which would be a very normal progression, wouldn't it? That's a 1-4 progression in the key of C. Well, there are all these rules about how your notes have to move from one voice to the next, from one chord to the next in the progression in order to make your music sound smooth and successful. These are what are called the rules of motion. You have to double certain notes. Usually you double the root. If two consecutive chords share a note, then that note is carried over from one voice to the next. There are certain provisos. Your bass is cut loose from certain rules of motion. Your melody up on top is the melody that everyone's going to hear as the melody of the piece, and that is relaxed a little bit in terms of its rules. But as each of these notes move along, there are all these types of movements. If two go up and they go up the same interval or down the same interval, that's what's known as parallel motion. If they both go up or down, but it's not quite the same interval, like one voice goes up a half step and one voice goes up a whole step, that's what's called similar motion. If one stays the same when it carries over to the next chord and the other one moves, that's called oblique motion. If they go in opposite directions, this note goes up and this note goes down, that's what's called opposite motion. There are rules. If you take a music theory class, if you want to get a degree in music, if you want to get a degree in composition, you have to read the textbooks and memorize all the rules about how each note in this 4-part structure is supposed to move as you progress from one chord to the next in the harmony. It is beyond the scope of this program to turn you on to all those various rules. And the thought I wanted to leave you with is sometimes people go, you're talking about ensembles of monophonic instruments. A guitar is a polyphonic instrument. I'm playing the chords myself. Do I really have to understand the rules of proper voice leading? And I go, yes, you do. I mean, you owe it to yourself if you really want to particularly play more sophisticated styles of music. Eventually you're going to get to the point where you're thinking about when you proceed from one chord to the next, strumming your chords. If you're strumming a C chord and then you go to an F chord, how are each of the individual notes in those chords moving as you proceed from the C chord to the F chord? So yes, everybody, all real musicians should know something about proper voice leading. However, guitar players are oftentimes spared having to know a lot about voice leading for a couple of reasons, I think. First of all, a guitar, shall we say, is a monotimbral instrument. It's a polyphonic instrument. It plays many notes, but all those notes tend to come at you with the same timbre. They tend to sound the same. You know what I mean? Do the 6 strings of your guitar actually have a different sound quality about them? Yes, they do slightly because they're different diameters of wire and stuff like that. But on the whole, all of the notes that you play sound the same in terms of the timbre. But if you're looking at a 4-part, let's say a string quartet, then you have a cello down at the bottom and a viola and 2 violins. Or if you have a wind ensemble, maybe you've got a bassoon down here or a French horn, and maybe you've got a clarinets and flutes and oboes and stuff up here. Each one of these has its own sound, doesn't it? A French horn sounds different than an oboe. So when you've got this 4-part movement, you are much more cognizant of the movements of each voice than you are when you play a guitar. When I strum a chord on the guitar, you're more apt to hear this as just a glob of notes. It's not so easy for the untrained, particularly ear, to pull out each of the individual notes that's in this chord. If I strum it, it comes at you as a pile of notes, and you hear it as a singular thing. You don't hear each of the individual notes in that chord unless you have very good ears or trained ears, at which point you do begin to hear distinctions like that. But a guitar chord comes at you as one glob, so it's not quite so the voice leading, I want to say, is not absolutely quite as critical as it would be if each of the notes was being played on a different instrument. That's one thing that saves guitar players from having to learn every last rule about proper voice leading. The other thing that saves us from having to know every last rule about voice leading is the notion that, in a kind of a funny way, the way the guitar is tuned. You remember there's 4 notes in between each string. Intervals between the strings that you're playing in these chords are quite frequently thirds and fourths between the individual strings and the individual notes you're playing in the chord. In a funny kind of way, the guitar takes care of its own voice leading by itself. If you're playing standard chords in a given area of the neck of the guitar, it's almost like you almost can't help but create fairly successful voice leading. And what I thought I would do is show you a couple of examples of that down here so that you can see what I'm talking about. Let's look at our example up here was a C major chord becoming an F major chord, and we just came up with this hypothetical voicing where the bass C dropped down to F, the G dropped down to this F here, or possibly it could have gone up to this A here. The E went up a half step to the F, and the C, which is a note that's shared by both a C chord and an F chord. Remember, C is the tonic note of a C chord, and it's the 5 in the key of C. Notice how this one carried right over into the next chord right there. Now, that was just a hypothetical voice leading exercise that we did to transit from a C chord to an F chord. How do you literally do that when you play a C major chord in the C form on the guitar, and then you go to an F major chord in the E form on the guitar? And haven't we heard a bunch of songs? That's a 1-4 progression in the key of C, isn't it? I'm going from a C chord to an F chord. Let's take a look at what notes I'm actually playing when I strum those chords. First thing to realize is we're talking 4-part harmony, right? But in that C major chord, I was strumming 5 strings. I was actually playing 5 notes. And in the F major, in the E form, I was actually strumming all 6 strings, so I was actually producing 6 notes. The guitar has kind of almost like a scattergun effect. It throws so many notes at the chord sometimes that it's almost like you can't help having reasonably successful voice leading because there's just so many notes in there. It's almost like you can't go wrong. Let's take a look. Here's how, in standard notation, that C major chord in the C form would look. The notes you're playing are C is your bass note, E, G, C, E. You're playing 5 notes, C, E, G, C, E. The 3 notes in a C major triad are C, E, and G, but you're also repeating the C and the E in a higher octave up there too. Now, when you go to play that E major bar chord of an F major chord in the E form, what would that look like? It would look like this. F, C, F, A, C, F. Like that. 6 notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So already we're outside of the realm of 4-part harmony, aren't we? We're throwing so many notes at it. Now let's take a look at what's happening in terms of the voice leading. Well, first, let's see. Let's write the notes here. F, C, F, A, C, F are the notes you're playing in an F major chord. Now, the first thing we notice, let's take our lowest voice. Well, the C is plummeting down an interval of a perfect fifth. To go from C, it's going down an interval of a fifth down to F. Now that's a big jump, and remember, we're supposed to have our voices move as little as possible, but remember your bass voice is kind of exempt from that because it oftentimes it simply has to go to where the root of the new chord is, no matter how far away that is. Now let's take a look at other things that are happening. In a C major chord, you have a C note right here, right? And you also have the C note in the F chord because it's the 5th. Well, notice how this voice just carried over. It didn't go up or down. That is one of the things you're supposed to do in proper voice leading. If 2 chords, consecutive chords, share a note, that note is supposed to be just carried over into the next voice. Look at this C down here. It was the root note of our C major chord. It's the 5th in the key of C. This voice kind of carried over too. you know, we got an extra note in here that we're going to have to abandon at some point. But you know what I mean? It's sort of like you see these parallel movements are happening anyway, just because of the way the guitar is tuned. Now, notice how it might be fair for us to say that this E. Now, we don't have an E and an F chord, do we? But we do have an F note. So is it fair to say that what happened was this E went up by a half step to become this F over here? Maybe it's also fair to say that this G went up a whole step to become this A over here. Now, that's pretty cool, isn't it? Remember, one of the other rules of proper voice leading is that the notes don't want to jump around too much. Here, we only had movements of half steps and whole steps to get to the next chord. Finally, if we look at our highest voice up here, notice once again that all that happened was this E went up a half step to become this F over here. So, in a sense, just the act of playing your standard type chords on the guitar gives you a fairly successful a type of voice leading on the instrument. This is what spares guitar players a lot of times from really having to go in and memorize all the rules of proper voice leading. I mean, you can screw this up if you want to. You can do stupid things like play a C way down at the bottom of the neck and play an F way up here above the octave or something. Now, that won't sound like a very smooth transition from chord to chord, will it? But if you stay in one region of the neck or don't move around too much and employ the various standard fingerings for these chords, you're going to find out that the voice leading kind of takes care of itself. But it is a fascinating area of study in many ways. For myself, where I am in music these days, my compositions, more and more, I'm getting more involved in making sure that my voice leading is correct. Now, that was just what was left over from our last subject, and interestingly enough, that is pretty much the end of our discussion on chords. You know an awful lot about chords. You know the formulas for chords, you know about your triads, you know about chord voicing, you know about different inversions and how to finger them, and you even know a bit about four-part harmony and voice leading, which, boy, I mean, like I said, you're not going to find too many people in your life who know any of this stuff about how music works. That puts you light years ahead of everyone else. You might go, if they don't know this stuff, why do I have to know it? The answer is you can accomplish in 2 years what a lot of other people take 10 years to do, because you can think on your instrument. And particularly in the area of chording, you know a lot of that stuff now. We're in a very exciting place here. We're getting towards the end of the program. You might recall that what we've been working our way through in part 2 here has been what I call the 6 levels of pitch theory. This is where we're actually learning our 50 different pitch patterns, and we've been learning them in order of complexity in 6 different increments. The first increment, if you remember way back when, was silence. We said, where would music be without silence? Then, what's the next most complex patterns of pitch? The area of what we call the note, where we learned that everything in conventional music has a root note associated with it, one of the cornerstones of Western music. Then we looked at the next most complex patterns involving 2 notes. That, of course, is the huge subject of intervals. Hopefully you've been looking your notes over, replaying these tapes, doing your memorization. If you want to satisfy yourself playing music, you got to know all this stuff. It's not that much, is it? 50 lousy patterns. And remember, you got to know your patterns 4 different ways. Think, read, hear, speak. 50 patterns. You know, a couple of years you could get all that done if you really kind of work at it. Level 3 was intervals. Once we understand what intervals are, we string a whole bunch of intervals together and we get the fascinating world of scales and modes. And this is where, interestingly enough, we first started to learn about chord progressions, didn't we? We saw that the progressions of chords often evolve out of systems of modes through a process called harmonization of a scale. You look at the modes and you look at the embedded chords within those modes, and that tells you a lot about how standard chord progressions work. Now, the level that we are just finishing was level 5, which is chords and arpeggios. And we learned all about chord voicing and all that stuff. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's now time for us to look at the 6th level of complexity in pitch, in music. And it is level number 6. It is the whole subject of chord progressions. Now, the funny thing is, this is essentially just mostly going to be a review for you, because if you remember, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, most of what there is to know about chord progressions you already know about, because we talked a lot about them during the subject of scales and modes when we were talking about the embedded chords within systems of modes. This whole subject is the whole subject of harmonization. We learned that different chord progressions evolve out of systems of modes through the process of harmonization. We talked about certain different styles of harmony. We encountered words like tertian harmony, where the notes are intervals of a major or minor or augmented third apart from one another. Accounts for the structure of a lot of our chords. We talked a little bit about triadic harmony. We said that an awful lot of what happens in songs and the chords we choose are based on these basic types of chords called triads. Major triad is 1-3-5, minor triad is 1-flat-3-5, augmented triad 1-3 sharp 5, diminished triad 1-flat-3 flat 5. Hopefully you're starting to memorize all this stuff too. We talked about chordal harmonies. We didn't talk much about them. Mostly that's in more advanced music. Modern jazz employs a lot of chordal harmonies. More sophisticated styles of modern classical type music, if you want to call it that. Not a lot of chordal stuff happening in pop, rock, country, folk, any of that kind of stuff. But anyway, there are basic scenarios that guide how chord progressions work, and we have already examined most of these, so we're just going to do a little bit of a review. How do the chords... Why do we keep seeing the same combinations of chords over and over again in our chord progressions? Well, it's because they evolve out of systems of modes. And the first type of harmonization that we discussed way back when, the one that blew our minds about how easy it is to improvise and construct melodies, is harmonizations based on the major diatonic scale. So our first harmonization that we learned about is major diatonic harmonization. Take the modes of a major scale: Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and Locrian. And within those modes are embedded certain chords, aren't they? Remember, the one chord evolves out of the major diatonic scale itself. So the one chord is a major chord in a major key harmonization. The 4 and 5 chords, you'll also recall, are both major chords, because the Lydian and Mixolydian modes, the 4th and 5th modes, are major scales, so they have major chords embedded inside them. Now, you also remember that the 2 chord was minor, and the 3 chord was minor. That's the Dorian and Phrygian modes. The 6th mode, Aeolian, is also minor, and it's in fact the most important minor one. Most likely minor chord that's going to show up is the 6th chord in a major key, major diatonic harmonization. Finally, you will recall that the 7 chord was neither a major or minor. It had a flatted third. So why isn't it minor? Because it also had a flatted 5th, and that makes it more closely related to the subject of diminished. Right there. Now, major diatonic. Hopefully you know all about that. If not, go back and review that tape on major diatonic harmony a la mode. That set the stage for us to understand all of these other types of harmonizations. The second type of harmonization we learned was there is major key music, there is also minor key music. And the first type of harmonization we looked at in a minor key is what might be called natural minor harmonizations. Now, remember, the main rule of thumb when it comes to this can be summed up in 3 words. Remember that? 6 becomes 1. All of a sudden now, the Aeolian mode, or the 6th mode of the major diatonic scale: 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, 8. The natural minor scale becomes the scale that we harmonize. Gives us the same old modes even in the same old order. It's just you're starting on 6. You're starting on the natural minor. You're starting on the Aeolian mode. So in a natural minor harmonization, the 1 chord is a minor chord. It's the old 6 chord. The new 2 is the old 7 then, which is diminished. It's our good old friend, the Locrian mode. Our third mode is our good old friend, the major scale itself, the major diatonic scale. So in a natural minor harmonization, the 3 chord is a major chord. The 4 chord is our good old friend Dorian, so it's minor. The 5 mode is Phrygian, which is also minor. The 6th mode is our good old friend the Lydian, which is major. And the 7th mode is Mixolydian, which is also major. So these are the types of normal chords that we would see in a minor key chord progression, in a sad-sounding song in a minor key. Finally, remember that other thing we said, yeah, but we like minor key songs, sad-sounding songs, but we don't like it that the 5 chord is always a minor chord. We like music where it's a sad-sounding song in general, but we wanted the 5 chord to be a major chord. So remember my whole fable about the guy and the king of music and how he wrote the song that broke the rules where the 5 chord was major? Remember that whole silly thing? Well, you might remember that was all based on harmonizing a harmonic minor scale. And remember, in harmonic minor, the difference between natural minor and harmonic minor goes 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, just like natural minor, but then it skips. It doesn't include flat 7 the way the natural minor does. It jumps all the way up to 7 and then a half step to 8, meaning that interval right there is a step and a half interval. Now, what that means is that it changes all of these different modes down here. They're not identical to the modes of the natural minor. It doesn't mean that the chord is always changed. And again, like I say, you can go back and review that stuff on the tape on harmonic minor. But it does change 3 of the chords embedded in the modes. Harmonic minor has 3 chords that are different than 3 of the chords in a harmonization of the natural minor. The 1 chord is still minor, because it's got a minor triad embedded inside it. The 2 chord is still diminished because that shifted note didn't change any of the notes that are in the triad. However, the 3 mode, which in natural minor you might recall was a major chord. It was our good old friend the Ionian mode, as a matter of fact. Now the 5th has been raised and it becomes an augmented triad. This is the one and only time that we saw an augmented chord in any of our other harmonizations. The 4 chord remains minor because the shifted note there, that 7 up there, which is the shifted note from the flat 7, doesn't affect any of the notes in that triad. It remains minor. The 5 chord, however, is shifted. Its 3rd is shifted up a half step, and it becomes major, and that's one of the most significant reasons why the harmonic minor scale was developed, so that 5 chord would become major. The 6th chord also remains major because the shifted note does not affect the 6th mode. And 7th, which was also major, is another one that's changed. It's become now diminished. So a harmonization of harmonic minor gives you a chord progression: 1 minor, 2 diminished, 3 augmented, 4 minor, 5 major, 6 major, 7 diminished. And you will see chord progressions based on that way of thinking too. The other types of harmonizations that we looked at were modal harmonizations. Remember, we gave you a couple of examples of chords. Like, for example, I think the first one we gave you was a progression that went from an E minor chord to an A major chord. You can't justify a chord progression like that in any normal major key or in any normal minor key. So you're going, what's going on here? Well, remember, there is music where the home chord is neither the 1 chord as it is in major diatonic harmonizations or the 6 chord as it is in minor key harmonizations. It's one of the other modes. And the 2 most common modes that will function as the home chord for a chord progression, a fairly normal chord progression, are the 2 mode, which is Dorian, and the 5 mode, which is Mixolydian. Let's look at a Dorian harmonization here. In this sense, what we're saying is 2 has become 1. So the Dorian mode now is going to be the mode that has the 1 chord embedded in it. That's a minor chord because Dorian is a minor scale, isn't it? That moves Phrygian up to here. So the 2 chord in a Dorian harmonization is also a minor chord. The 3 chord is our old 4 chord. It's Lydian, which is major. 4 is now Mixolydian, which, as you recall, is major. Our good old friend, the Aeolian mode, which used to be the 6th mode, is now dropped down one to be the 5 mode. So the 5 chord in a Dorian harmonization is actually a minor chord. The 6th chord is diminished. It's the good old Locrian mode. And the 7th mode is our original major scale, the Ionian mode, so it is major too. So, a chord progression in a Dorian harmonization would go, the 1 chord would be minor, the 2 chord would be minor, the 3 chord would be major, the 4 chord would be major, the 5 chord would be minor, the 6 chord would be diminished, and the 7th chord would be major. Now, if some of you have jumped ahead, time to remind you, remember, well, the beauty of this program is you're getting the information in the right order. If you all of a sudden decided you were going to jump up here and look at chord progressions, you're sitting there right now going, what the heck is this guy talking about? Remember, you've pretty much got to follow this program through tape by tape. If you do that, the other people are sitting at home who have done that are looking at this going, oh, yeah, okay, I get it. Yeah, oh, that's easy. Yep, I understand all this stuff. So remember, it's kind of a logical progression of ideas. That's the beauty of this program. You will understand it if you've been following all the way through. If you've done a little bit of memorization through here, this shouldn't be throwing you for any kind of loop. The second, possibly the most common modal harmonization is a harmonization of the Mixolydian mode. And that means that 5 has become 1. So our home scale is the Mixolydian mode, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, 8. And Mixolydian would be then the 1 mode. And it being a major scale, it has a major chord embedded in it. So the 1 chord in a Mixolydian harmonization is major. The 2 chord is the old 6 chord, or the old 6 mode, which is Aeolian, which is minor. The 3 mode now would be the old 7 mode, which was Locrian, which is diminished. The 4 chord is now going to be our good old friend, the major diatonic scale, the Ionian mode. So the 4 chord in a Mixolydian harmonization is going to be major. The 5 chord is going to be the old 2 chord, which is Dorian. It's going to be minor. The 6 chord is going to be the old 3, which is Phrygian, so it's going to be minor. And then the 4th mode, the 7th mode is going to be the old 4 mode, which is Lydian, which is major. So a harmonization of a Mixolydian scale gives you a chord progression: 1 major, 2 minor, 3 diminished, 4 major, 5 minor, 6 minor, 7 major. Now, the last type of harmonization that we talked about isn't really really kind of a totally different type of harmonization at all. I just want to remind you that another huge style of music in the Western world is this stuff that's called blues music. And blues is a huge subject. I was reminded of this when we had Danny Lawson over, and how much there really is to know about the blues and all that, and how it's over the decades it has taken so many different directions. But at the core of this is a basic understanding that blues harmony is somewhat different than the way diatonic harmony works in any of its many forms right here. So we might talk for a moment about a blues harmonization. Remember, blues is very often associated with 1, 4, 5 chord progressions. It's also associated a lot with the minor pentatonic scale: 1, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 7, 8. As you recall, a lot of people think of this as a what we would call a blues scale. Now, remember, the whole thing that separates blues harmony from diatonic harmony are these things that are called blue notes. And what these are is non-diatonic note choices, some of them rather dissonant, and that have evolved in this century. We seem to crave more and more dissonance in music as time goes on. The pretty stuff just sounds a little too pretty after a while, and we're looking for a little more dirt and a little more movement. And the blues is a style of music that has a lot of that. It has these weird, if you will, weird-sounding blue notes, and we identified some of those. Remember, there's what's called a blues third. First of all, a 1-4-5 progression in normal diatonic major key harmony, wouldn't that be all major chords? So what the heck are we doing playing a minor pentatonic scale over this at all? Well, there's your first blue note. Remember, you can play either the flatted third or the major third. That's that thing called a blues third. The distinction between major and minor, in a sense, is a little bit blurred in the blues, and you get these really dirty notes where you play a flatted third over a major chord that has a major third in it, and those notes clash quite badly. But that is one of the main essences of what blues harmony is all about. We also found that there's a large use of flat sevens in the blues in places that you wouldn't normally use it. A couple of other blue notes that players put in all the time, if you look at your page of blues scales, is sharp fours and sharp fives. These are a couple of other blue notes. And frequently the 7 is added in as a little blue note here, so you kind of have this blues 7th up there at the top too. Remember, another big point I try to make is that when you go to the 4 chord in a blues chord progression, you're not still playing the tonic minor pentatonic scale, are you? You're playing one of that scale's modes. This note, which originally started as the 4, is now the 1, and this note is carrying down. Those of you who understand what I'm talking about modes, those of you who know what I meant about blues harmony because you looked at that tape already and have done some memorization, I'm not going to go any further with that, because it's all right back there. And then you've got that great tape with Danny showing you all those cool blues licks and everything, those finger tricks and all that have become part of the vocabulary of playing blues. It represents a different type of harmonization, represents a different way of thinking about how scales and melodies are constructed out of scales to go over certain types of chord progressions. This is an awful lot. You already knew all this stuff. This is an awful lot about what chord progressions are all about. But there's 2 other things that are going to happen in chord progressions that you need to be familiar with. And this is going to be our basically really new information for today. These are different types of harmonizations here. These are different whole styles of music that you're going to hear. Major diatonic, natural minor, harmonic minor, Dorian harmonizations, Mixolydian harmonizations, blues harmonizations. I want to suggest that one other thing that's going to happen a lot. We're going to have a whole nother category down here at the bottom of the page down here. We're going to call it weird stuff. I'm going to suggest that in the history of music, there's a whole lot of stuff that might just be referred to as weird stuff that can't be essentially analyzed from any point of view of this normal types of harmonizations. Now, this weird stuff runs the gamut from very, very highly academic, experimental music that the master's degree geniuses at the New England Conservatory are working on, runs the gamut from that down to the dumb junk that the garage band, the ugly racket that the guitar band, garage band down the street plays, where they don't really have any clue what they're doing at all. They're just making a bunch of weird noises with their instruments. Now, so this is stuff that can't be identified or analyzed harmonically from what we know about conventional chord progressions and harmony. Let's start with the genius level stuff. As we've said, music, the history of music is one of normalcy and what's called consonance. Pretty normal. I never know what quite word to say. Over the centuries, this has deteriorated. Deteriorated? That's a value statement. But it has become more and more. Music has become more. It has become less and less pretty. It has become more and more dirty. It has become more and more dissonant, more and more atonal over time. Part of the reason for that is the people that are really involved in music, the people that study it day in and day out for years, have gotten kind of sick of all the pretty stuff. You know what I mean? And if you listen to the history of music, I'm selling these people short, but Mozart is dirtier than Bach. Beethoven is more dissonant than Mozart. Tchaikovsky is more dissonant than Beethoven. Stravinsky is more dissonant than Tchaikovsky. You know, and on into the modern stuff that is the cutting edge of classical music these days. Some of it is so weird and ugly sounding you wouldn't want to listen to it at all. Or a lot of you wouldn't. Actually, I find a lot of that stuff very interesting to listen to. But There are whole styles of music that you might never have heard of, stuff like a style of music that's called 12-tone serial music. You see, music has become more and more chromatic over time, employing, remember, all of these harmonizations that we were looking at up here really only utilized like maybe 7 of the 12 notes. We've said before that most conventional songs do not contain all 12 notes. The most conventional pieces of music only contain 7 notes, and they're arrayed in these very predictable types of harmonizations based on these systems of modes. But more and more, the history of music has become more chromatic, where more and more players have, and composers have been adding more and more of the 12 notes. And indeed, in the 20th century, an actual aim that composers have had is an actual thing that they've tried to create is music that has no tonal center. They've tried to do away with the notion that you're playing a song in a particular key. They actually want to destroy that. Why? Well, it just seemed like a good idea. It seemed like it was going to be fun at the time. It produces a lot of very strange sounding music. One style that I could just describe to you a little bit is what's called 12-tone music. In 12-tone music, all of the 12 notes are given equal credence. There's not this hierarchy of like the tonic note, and what's the second most important note? The dominant. Remember the 5, and then the subdominant is the 4. That has another really powerful center to it. The thirds are very important. In 12-tone music, what they were completely trying to do was make every one of the 12 notes equally important. It's almost like a mind game that composers decided to play with themselves in order to just break things loose. They found that regular, normal harmonization was getting awfully boring, and everybody was sick of it. They were hearing the same things. Gee, let's try to come up with some new way to write music. I'll tell you what, let's take the 12 notes, and what they do is they kind of take all 12 notes and arrange them in some kind of sequence, but they use all 12 of them. And as I understand it, now I'm not, the last word in understanding music history and music theory and all, but as I understand it, 12-tone music kind of has some rules to it. And one of the rules is sort of something like you can't repeat. You have to use all 12 notes, and you can't repeat any one of the 12 notes until you've used all the other 11 first. This is a goal. This is a game that composers began to play with themselves in order to break things loose and try to create a new style of music. Think of how different music like that is going to sound than 3-chord rock, where the guy strums the 1 chord, the 4 chord, and the 5 chord, and then goes back to the 1 chord and plays the 4 chord and the 5 chord. This is music that is much less repetitive. A lot of people, who like classical music and don't like rock music, one of their complaints is rock music is so repetitive. That guy gets up there and just strums those same 3 chords over and over again, and I just bores me to death. And a lot of you may get to that at some point earlier in your career. That may not bother you and all that, but if you've been playing as long as I have, at a certain point you begin to go, geez, I'm sick of these 3-chord rock tunes. What else is out there? And then you progress into more complex structures, and eventually you may find yourself up into more chromatic music. The music of the 20th century is much more chromatic. Now, other styles of weird music. So that's what I want to talk about in terms of the genius level, cutting edge stuff that is not going to fit into these normal types of harmonizations, stuff that we might call weird stuff. Now let's go to the other side of the spectrum. There's a lot of weird stuff out there that, to my mind, you can hate what I'm about to say right now if you want, but it's just dumb stuff played by people that don't really know what they're doing. They, too, are maybe a little bit sick of music that sounds a little too pretty and all that stuff, so they just get up there and blast away and make a whole lot of weird noise. There is that, and then there is stuff that's very interesting that's just this side of that. A lot of this heavy metal, hard rock, alternative stuff that we're listening to a lot today. Don't get me wrong, I find a lot of that stuff very interesting. Certain bands, certain other bands, I just don't care about at all. But they are using notes in whole new ways. And at this point now, combinations of notes in whole new ways. I'm going to wind up confessing to you that a lot of you who like bands, say, like, it's the year 2000 again, bands like Pantera, and there's a whole bunch of them. You hear a lot of these really jarring movements of power chords, and if you look at the root notes of those chords and you try to fit it into some diatonic framework, you find out that you really just can't do that at all. You're working with your slide rule here, looking at your modes, and you're going, I can't make these chords work in any kind of framework at all. And this is music. I'll try to fake a little bit here. I can't think of any tunes that I've memorized off the top of my head. But first of all, we're oftentimes dealing with these power chord types of distortion on the guitars. And you're hearing things like this, You know what I mean? These don't sound like normal movements of chords in the prettier type of normal. You know what that is right there? I'm going from the 1 chord to the flat 5 chord. Now, in none of our more normal harmonizations did we ever include the chord rooted on the flat 5, did we? That's because a normal, pretty music wouldn't have a combination of chords like that. It's left to people that are sick of that kind of just too pretty, too normal sounding stuff. And many of these bands are very clever in the way that they almost avoid any kind of tie to diatonic harmony at all. Now, you might ask the question, how do you improvise over that? How do you solo over chord progressions like that? Well, I'm going to tell you another thing you might not want to hear. A lot of the stuff you hear of these bands playing over these odd chord progressions, if you ask me, is just dumb stuff. You hear a lot of speed for speed's sake. If you were actually down listening to how each of the notes in the melody relate to the underlying chord progression, you're going to find out there is hardly any relationship, any meaningful relationship at all. Now, I'm not even saying that that's a bad thing necessarily, because like I said, I'm sick of the same old normal, pretty sounding stuff too, to a certain degree. What you're going to find out is if you really pay attention to music history, there is a lot of music that manages to get outside of the pretty and normal, yet still manages to retain some kind of control and some kind of take you to some new interesting place that you haven't been before. A lot of the rest of it is just boneheaded garbage. And I'll probably, like for example, let me go to Pantera again. Now, there's Dimebag Darrell, and Dimebag Darrell is a very fast and technical player, and I find Pantera's music interesting many times, but many other times I just hear him playing a lot of dumb notes that don't relate very well to the chord progression underneath them at all. You're going, oh my God, I love Pantera. That's cool. You know what you're going to find out? Playing like that ain't all that hard. It's really come to the point where in many ways a lot of these players just use speed to kind of dazzle you, but the harmonizations don't really make a whole lot of sense. Even in Metallica, you hear a lot of guitar solos. Even in Guns N' Roses, you hear, I hear me, now you can't necessarily hear this stuff, but I hear really, really bad guitar solos in a lot of music. You might not be hearing it because you just love Guns N' Roses and you're willing to accept whatever they play. But when you get your ears trained a little better, sometimes I'm capable of listening to this stuff now and going, oh my God, if I was doing a solo over that, I would have done something much better than that, interestingly enough. The only reason I'm telling you that is not to tear down your great heroes. I'm telling you, if you want to play like Dimebag Darrell, or if you want to play like Slash, it ain't that hard. And someday you may be able to play much, much better than them if you train your ears, you learn the facts about how music works, you put a little discipline into it, and you'll be able to play, really much better than that. But what I am confessing to you is a lot of the music that a lot of you like, this hard rock, heavy metal, alternative music, does not have, in any sense, the types of normal harmonizations, the normal types of chord progressions that you're used to seeing. So the one thing I want you to understand is I'm not giving you license to blow all this stuff away and not learn it at all. What I'm going to suggest is you would have to understand this stuff in terms just simply in order to be able to understand how the music that you like, this weird stuff, is different from that. You know what I mean? It's like you'd have to understand the normal structures in order to figure out how to get beyond them into these more chromatic, more dissonant types of progressions that we hear in a lot of modern music like that. So just because you're just listening to hard rock and heavy metal at this point doesn't mean that you shouldn't learn your harmonizations here, because then the next thing that happens is all of a sudden, as you know, a lot of Metallica music has pretty little parts of it that are almost like classical guitar parts, you know? This is a band that, yeah, they do a lot of weird stuff, but they also come back to regular old standard old harmonizations. So does Pantera. So does everybody eventually. You know what I mean? So you've got to learn your normal stuff just to get beyond it in an intelligent way into more interesting styles of music. Okay, that is another type of harmonization. Oh, and you know, and another big thing that's happening a lot in modern music today, I think, is we are hearing music where timbre. Remember timbre? Boy, that word hasn't come up for a while, is it? Timbre, one of the 6 main areas of music. It's not about what notes you play and what patterns you arrange those notes in. It's about the quality of sound you produce. An interesting new facet of modern music, I think, is that timbre, particularly in the age of synthesizers and electronic instruments, timbre has become a significant new force in modern music, and enters into maybe the category of weird stuff, where we have bands like, shall I say, 9 Inch Nails and stuff like that, where in a way a lot of their music almost leaves the realm of a chord progression, melody, scale, and you know, I'm sure that I'm ignorant of a lot of the more obscure bands that are in this genre, that sometimes the art that they produce is less about notes and chords and scales and more about soundscapes involving different timbres, strange sounding things. Well, a thing I've been noticing in a lot of alternative music nowadays is there might even be the music up front, but in the background are all these strange studio effects and reverse echoes and strange industrial noises and stuff creeping into music too. And, you know, the old school goes, oh, what a bunch of crap that is. And I go, no, actually, no, I think it's rather interesting to listen to in many ways. And electronic instruments have given us a whole new thing to play around with in music, to the point where timbre has become more important than pitch. Lots of different examples of that. Other weird stuff that I might mention is things like free jazz and free improvisation, where the players get up there and they don't necessarily even have any idea what they're going to play before they start, and they just get up there and make a lot of weird noise. Now, again, I'm not trying to make a value judgment about that. I've found over the years a lot of that stuff very interesting too. Bands that are kind of into the really weird stuff like that you might know of are bands like Primus. And a big reputation, Les Claypool, bass player. Very unconventional usages of notes in there. Bands like Fish, Primus, King Crimson. King Crimson is a band that's been around for decades. Very interesting band that drifts back and forth from normal harmonizations into just making screeching weird noise with electronic instruments. Free improvisation, where the players just get up there and just play whatever they feel and try to relate to each other in some abstract way. Sometimes they're successful at it, sometimes they fail miserably at it. Jazz has a huge history of what might be called free improvisation, where players, bands like Weather Report and stuff like that, where the players are more like 4 individuals rather than trying to fit into a cohesive structure. And Ornette Coleman is a famous jazz saxophone player who involved in a lot of really more advanced stuff, but a lot of people can't listen to that at all. It's just too weird for them to listen to. The majority of you out there listening to this program are interested in popular music, more normal styles of popular music. Now, some of you are into, like I say, this alternative stuff that's much more chromatic and strange, but a lot of you are into more normal styles of harmonization, and that's where you want to go in there and learn and memorize these different styles of harmonization. First of all, because if you're interested in music theory at all, which you probably have to be in order to maintain your interest in music. Remember, if we haven't mentioned this lately, it's sort of like, you know, everybody plays guitar in their 20s, but if you want to remain and keep yourself satisfied and interested in music over the course of your life, you're probably going to find yourself getting bored with the same old stuff and developing into more and more advanced styles of music. In order to do that, you've got to know what you're doing. None of my friends are still playing anymore. I'm like the only one left. And the same thing's going to happen to you. If you learn your stuff, you're going to be jamming with your friends in high school, jamming with your friends in college. You're going to be 50 and you're still going to be playing, and you're going to be seeing all your old friends, and they will have given up music decades ago. So you basically got to you've got to know your stuff. So one last thought, and this is what our program is going to be about next time. We're just going to start to get into this a little bit today. Remember, we are almost at the end. There's only like 2 more shows after this. We are at level 6 of my 6 levels of theory, chord progressions, all about harmonizations, all about taking scales and harmonizing them and finding out what chords are embedded in the systems of modes that those chords generate. Major diatonic, natural minor, harmonic minor, Dorian harmonizations, Mixolydian harmonizations, blues harmonizations. Finally, weird stuff that can't be analyzed on any level, but there is still one more thing that can happen in chord progressions that you should know about. Actually, it's a couple of related subjects that we're going to be talking about in the next show. One thing is this: even in very conventional music, there is nothing that says that a piece of music has to remain in one key all the way through. There are many pieces of music that right in the song itself, you change from one key into a different key. This subject, the subject of changing keys right within a song, is the whole subject of what's called modulation. Now, some of you may have heard that word before, and you might have discovered that you see a chord progression that's modulating because maybe you've got a song that you've been playing, and maybe you're thinking like I'm trying to get you to think, and you're looking at your slide rule, and you've got your set of modes in front of you in a given key, like you're in the key of G, let's say, and you go, oh, look, this song has a G major and a C major and a D major and an E minor, just like I was expecting it to have in it, but hey, wait a minute, look, this song's got an A major chord in it, too. Now, that's not supposed to be in a song in the key of G. In a song in the key of G, A is the 2 chord embedded in the Dorian mode. It's supposed to be a minor chord. What has this song got an A major chord in it? It might even be stranger. You might be playing a song in the key of G, and all of a sudden you look in the chord progression and you see that it's got like a D flat chord in it. And you're going, hey, there isn't even a D flat note in a G major scale, let alone you wouldn't be expecting to see a D flat chord in a song in the key of G. What has happened here? Well, possibly you're dealing with some kind of modulation. You're dealing with a piece of music that has actually changed key at some point. And we're going to be talking about modulation. Modulation is a huge subject. It's another one of those things that I'm just going to be able to tell you certain things about it. And that's what we're going to talk about in our next show. Another thing that can happen in chord progressions quite often is certain chords can replace other chords in the chord progression. These are what are called substitutions. Some songs contain odd chords that you weren't expecting to see because certain chords are substituting themselves for chords that you would have normally seen in the progression. So next week, our next show, our subject is going to be modulations. We're also going to be talking a little bit about substitutions. And then, boy, I tell you, that's just about it in conventional music. There's a lot more to know about music than just that stuff right there. But you're going to have to figure out the rest of that stuff on your own as you go through your career as a musician, and hopefully you will find that a joyous process as I have. I love learning about music. Music is a fun thing to know about as long as you realize it's not so scary as a lot of people are going to try to get you to think. Okay, next week we'll talk about modulations. Then in our last show, we're going to wrap the whole thing up and tie up some loose ends and and away you go, and you'll just be off, and you'll be able to do so much with music. Until then, I'm Scotty West. We'll see you next week, and enjoy and keep on practicing and looking over your old material. Okay, bye bye.